Um, since the 1960s, pretty flat. And then in 2000, it begins to take off when they start deregulating. People could borrow 100% of the money against their house, which traditionally for many years you had to put 20% of your own money and get a mortgage for 80%. No more. You could get. There were companies that were giving 120% of the value of the house so that you could fix it up. Of course, you couldn't pay for it, right? Then they created some very interesting and exotic ways in which you could finance the house. One of them was the balloon payment. That is, for the first 5 years or 10 years, the homeowner would only have to pay interest, and then in the 10th year, the principal would begin to come, and so suddenly your payment went from $1,000 a month to $5,000 a month. Guess what? People, at least in the U.S., don't think in terms of 10 years. They're only thinking about the next year. And the typical homeowner in the 80s and 90s was upgrading all the time. So they would live in a house for 5 to 7 years, and they would sell it and move into a bigger house, get a bigger mortgage. Guess what? 10 years, suddenly the mortgages had dried up. People were not giving you loans, and now you were faced with a payment instead of $1,000 a month, $5,000 a month, which you could not afford, and foreclosures, all kinds of problems, and that basically, this fell off the roof. This is what happened to the banks. This is the market capitalization of all the major banks in 2007, second quarter, and the first quarter of 2009. I don't know if you can read this, but look, all you have to do is look at the biggest one, which is Citigroup, that was worth $255 billion, and after this disaster was worth $19 billion. Now, this is what the book argues about too big to fail. So if you look at HSBC, JP Morgan Chase, Royal Bank of Scotland, UBS, all of them, if it happened to a normal company where the market value dropped from 255 billion to 19, you would go out of business. But all these entities are still around because they got this huge bailout from first from the United States, and then the Europeans did that as well. But it's always good to look at the larger picture, as I started the lecture with. I don't know if you can see the lines, but this is the last 10 recessions that we've had. And what was the biggest recession? The Great Depression, 1929, right? So that's this line down here. That was how far it fell. So when you trace it back, it's here, right? The current recession, at least till 2008, was at a steeper rate than the 1929. And that's why all these governments were trying to take extraordinary measures to prop it back up. And luckily, at least the current 2012 data shows that we are on the upswing, but we're not out of the woods yet. There is still that possibility that we could wind up in a double-dip recession. All that has to happen is only one of the players, big players, whether it's a country, a government, a major bank, to take a false step, and we are down in that second cycle again. All right, so as I said, I'm going to take a long way around to get to the idea of the new world economy. So we had the old world, right? The Europeans, of course, the ancient world. I should have listed that as first, which included India and China. But with the very ethnocentric mindset that exists in the United States and Europe. They only see themselves. Anyway, so the old world is Europe, new world is the United States. The third world is a pejorative term that these were the backward nations, the problematic nations. But of course, that's certainly in the case of India and China. They proved them wrong, and they are really the current saviors because of production of goods and services. India, of course, is the back office for many, many corporations around the world. Anyway, so the next world, what does the next world refer to? Well, in the religious sense, it's the next world, after you pass. But we're not talking about that yet. So, what happens next? Well, again, it's good to look at history. And if you look at governments prior to the 1920s, when they dealt with economic matters, they looked at economic growth, worker productivity, inflation, and unemployment. Those were the four major elements. And the way you dealt with that was through fiscal policy and monetary policy. Right? What has happened now is fiscal policy is dead because interest rates are close to 0%. So what are you going to do? What are you going to cut? Right? So that means that you're going to have to pump in more money. More money means inflation, which means loss of real growth. So this was prior to the 1920s. Since that time, the world has become more interdependent, and so now you have at least these many things that they have to worry about, those four concerns. But on top of that, foreign exchange, fiscal policies of other, monetary policies of other nations, and businesses have become so big that their actions have an impact on economies. And it really should be falling trade barriers. But the problem is not that the trade barriers are falling, which is actually a good thing, but they are falling at an uneven rate. The United States and China, even though they are pally-pally at one end, they are fighting about trade barriers because Chinese goods are being subsidized by the Chinese government, and the United States is arguing that we are going to start taxing you, which means putting up trade barriers. And it's not only between the United States and China. It's between China and India. I read in the paper yesterday or day before that India has become the largest rice exporter. Remember the 60s when we were importing food? Now we are the largest exporter. Just last year, we exported half as much, about 4 million tons. It's gone up to 10 million tons that we're exporting. So remember what I said about interdependent and interrelated. So if you have four things that are interdependent and interrelated, that's a problem. But when you have 10 things that are interdependent and interrelated, it makes the economist's job much more difficult to predict what's going to happen. So what economists are doing is they're looking at collectives to see what's going to happen, and here's a bunch of collectives that some of which were in the title of my talk. So in the 60s, you had the European Common Market, which became the European Union. So we know what that is, and it's been around a long time. OPEC, of course, has been around a long time as well. So here's your G7, right? They are the part of the old world. This is the old world that dominated economic growth during the 20th century, but is unlikely to do that in the 21st century. Obviously, Europe and the United States are there. The one lone non-old world country is Japan, but Japan, since the 60s, has been behaving like a old world country and is not doing well either. They've had an ongoing recession for almost 20 years. So here's a different grouping, and that's the G20. And the G20, as you can see, Asia and South America. They now account for 60% of the world's population, 70%, etc. You can read the data, but the point there is that these 20 nations are going to provide the engine for future growth if they are free to do that. Remember, the G7 is interacting and buying from these. So go back to my earlier slide about the environmental factors that are interacting, and it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. So within the G20, you start finding, if you read the economic literature, you find other groupings, and so I'm going to talk about some of them. So this is part of the old world that's doing worse than other parts of the old world. So you have the pigs. That's Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. And then you have the pigs with an I when you stick in Italy. And then you have pigs with two I's and two G's when you stick in Great Britain. And these countries basically are being held up or propped up, not held up, that's a different connotation, propped up by who? Germany, France, and the United States. The likeliest candidate to fail is Greece. And what's happened is that they've introduced all these austerity measures, which goes counter to Keynesian economics that says that if you have stagnant growth, government spending should go up. But at least the popular point of view out there is that you need to cut government spending in order to bring budgets under control. How many of you have read Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize winner? He writes 2 columns every week in the New York Times, and you could call him a post-Keynesian, and I would commend you to read some of his articles. You just Google it, and very short, very pithy, excellent articles. So these are the countries likely to be in trouble. These are the emerging 7, E7, the emerging countries. And they not only have economic clout, but they are beginning to get political clout. But there's some infighting between them. If you want to have political clout, you can have it in 2 ways. One, in terms of your government stature in relation to other countries in your region. The problem with India and China is that they are both in the same region, and China is a member of the United Nations Security Council, but India is not. And there's a movement to try and get India into the permanent membership, but China has strong objections. So how that's going to work out is another thing. But the E7 includes, what happened to the BRICS? Okay, I think I must have dropped that. BRICS. The E7 includes the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And so they're part of the E7. But those 4 comprise 70% of the GDP and the population and all of that of the E7. So here are civets. These are smaller countries, but they have certain interesting economic characteristics that economists think that they would contribute greatly to economic growth in the new world economy. Let's see what they have. All right, so Colombia, South Africa, Indonesia, Egypt, Turkey, and Vietnam. What economic characteristics do you think they have in common that will be useful in the future economic growth? Well, they have reasonable financial controls, number one. They have relatively controlled inflation and a young population. In these countries, about half the population is below the age of 25. Okay? So when we talked about human resources, there's a lot of human resource potential in these countries. The other thing that I heard Mahendraji mention is resources. They have physical resources that the rest of the world needs. And so they are in a pretty good position, and therefore that becomes an analytical unit, civets they're called.
Cheap labor.
Cheap labor as well, right. So you have mint and mist. One grouping includes includes Nigeria, which is the N, Mexico, Nigeria, Indonesia, and Turkey. But another grouping drops Nigeria because of the political considerations in Nigeria. It's a very politically unstable part of the world, and they put South Korea in there instead. South Korea is in fact has all of the elements of civets that I just mentioned: good financial system, good manufacturing, a fairly young population, and some resources. Actually, the problem that South Korea has is the same problem that Japan had, which is limited physical resources in their own country. So they rely a lot on imports. And then we have the so-called eagles, and that's the emerging and growth-leading economies. These are above the average. So all these countries have above average growth, and it includes the civets, the mints, the BRICS, and all of that. And as you can see, the G7 is not in there. So if you're talking about the new world economy, it's essentially this that is going to dominate the conversation for the next 20, 30 years. Almost getting to the end. So this is from CNN Money, and this is the position by size of the economies. And just make a note of it, because the next slide I'm going to show you is in the future. So the US has about a 15 trillion economy, and India is 10th. And those UK, Brazil, Italy, Russia, and India, and France are fairly even, right? So this is what is being projected for the future 5 years from now. Right? Notice what's happened. Those same countries, India, UK, Russia, France, they're still about the same, but the Indian economy has moved from the 10th place to the 6th place. But notice what's happened. Okay? China is about half of the US, and now it's almost 2/3 of the US. And the projections are that by 2025, China will have overtaken the US, and India most likely will have moved from 6th place to 3rd place. But all of that is forecasting, right? Making a lot of predictions. They may not happen depending on what happens. In India, it's actually much closer than that. Next year, you have the elections, and depends what happens. You know, it's Modi or Gandhi, right? This, I think, is my last slide. or almost the last slide. But this is an excellent graph. You should Google it, and you should actually look at it in your leisure time and try to study it. You know, the way you do center of gravity is you try and put things on a scale and it balances out, and then that tells you what the point is. So the economists figured out what the economic center of gravity is for the world economy, starting with the year 1 all the way to year 2025. And very interesting what happens, right? So the center of the world, economic world, was actually in Afghanistan. That was the point that balanced out the old civilizations of India and China and Japan against the dark ages in Europe. And then the center of gravity starts to move. It doesn't move much for 1,500 years, right? So from 81, the first year, to 1,500, it hasn't moved much. But then it suddenly takes off and moves to the west. And in 1820 to 1913, less than a century, it moves about 5,000, 7,000 miles. Because of what? What happened between 1820 and 1920? The Industrial Revolution, exactly. Thank you. And so the Industrial Revolution, basically Europe, the United States, and so it moved. And then in 1950, it reached the furthest point west. And since 1950 to now, 2010, in 60 years as opposed to 300 years, it's moved 5,000 miles back. That, in essence, is telling you about the economic power and the economic clout of China and India in particular, but the eagle countries that I mentioned in the earlier slide. So what's my prediction for the future in terms of the economic growth, the new world economy? Ta-da! We are headed into the jungle. Nobody knows. All right. So thank you very much. Now the idea is I spoke for what, an hour and a half? We're supposed to take another hour and a half for questions. So it's your job now to keep me on the stage.
Anyone?
Questions. As I said, questions, comments, or insights that you may have. None of us has the answers, so you may have the answers there. So share them with us. On the top, I'll go back to my original when we had the blackout. Anything about my university, my background to the United States? I'm yours for the next hour, so feel free to ask questions.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
So I have a question. Sir, there is a new term known as Fiscal Cliff, which has created a great furor in the United States. So what's your take on that?
Well, we were a few inches from the fiscal cliff in December 29th. We were 2 days away from falling off the cliff. But the U.S. Congress and the U.S. President, Barack Obama, managed to pull themselves back. Basically, what was going to happen on December 31st was, well, you have to go back a couple of years. The American political system is at a standstill because there is a lot of partisanship. The Republicans don't want to concede anything to the Democrats. If you look at some of the policies that are coming up from the Democrats and the Republicans, they are pretty similar. But they don't want the credit to go to the other side. And because the Republicans have the House of Representatives, they were holding the country hostage by saying, the United States needs money to finance itself, to pay the workers and all of that, and there's a debt ceiling that's been established, and only Congress can raise that debt ceiling so that the U.S. government can go out and borrow more money. And so basically they said, we are not going to raise the debt ceiling unless you cut taxes for the rich and cut spending and cut social programs and spend more money on the war machine. Republicans have that particular mentality. And so in order to bypass the last time that the ceiling was reached, they came to an agreement that said, come December 31st, if we don't have an agreement on the budget, then certain things will happen. So both sides came up with painful things from their perspective, so that the Democrats would cut social programs and the Republicans would cut defense spending, huge chunks. And December 31st was the date. And they thought that that Obama would not win the election and they would have a Republican president, and therefore the cliff would be avoided. Well, Obama won, and so now between November 4th and December 31st, they had to work out a way to not go over that cliff, because what that would do is the minute you have spending cuts, all these industries that the cuts are taking place in are affected, obviously, but defense is such a huge part of the U.S. government that the defense establishment would have to lay off people. The seniors who get Social Security would not get their annual increases. It was going to be painful all around. And the Republicans kept holding out for those cuts. And so they reached a compromise, and that's in essence what happened on December 31st. The next cliff, mini cliff, is March 31st. So by that time, they're going to run out of money again, and they're going to have to ask for an increase in the debt ceiling. And so in the next month and a half, they're going to try and work out a deal, Republicans and the Democrats, that hopefully will not take us off the cliff again. Other questions? Thomas Friedman, anybody know who Thomas Friedman is? Tom Friedman? No? He is a pretty liberal writer for the New York Times, and his focus for the last 20 years that I've been reading his articles has been on China and India and so forth. And in fact, he was in India until day before yesterday, and he wrote an article in the New York Times, op-ed section, on February 5th. So I want you to Google that as well. Very interesting article that compares India, China, and Egypt. His first line was that every time I come to India, the first question that he gets asked is, how is India doing compared to China? And so he said, okay, let's look at that perspective. And his prognostication is that he can't tell you which country will do well in the next 50 years, but China, India, and Egypt have three factors affecting them. One is the central government, the second is civil society, and third is the youthful population. So all three countries have them. The problem that China has is that they have a strong central government, but